Welcome to the latest episode of TDi Insights. I'm Sarah Wilkinson, Marketing Manager at TDi Sustainability, and I'm joined today by James Hollins, who is Head of Data and Due Diligence at TDi Sustainability. So today's topic is forced labour. So let's start with why we're having this conversation today. There's been numerous recent pieces of legislation that have come into force and that are coming into force around forced labour. And it's becoming essential that companies take these pieces of legislation into account when looking across their whole value chains. And you could even say, I think, James, that we're at a new sort of frontier when it comes to legislation, moving away from carbon and climate change legislation and the proliferation of all of the regulations relating to those areas, and really moving over to the area of labour and labour rights and human rights instead. And I think we're likely to see over coming years a great deal more legislation coming into being that companies really need to be aware of.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, there's been a significant amount of legislation proposed and upcoming legislation, particularly in the last few years. So the EU Forced Labour Act has just been agreed upon in the EU Parliament, and that will affect all 27 member states in Europe. So that's the big one in Europe. There's been a lot of proposed legislation outside Europe as well. So we're talking the Canadian Forced Labour Act as well. And the US already has established forced labour legislation with the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, but they're tightening that act as well. Mexico is also developing forced labour legislation. New Zealand has proposed forced labour legislation. What I would say is the UK developed the first forced labour legislation, the UK Modern Slavery Act, in 2015. That was the sort of the precursors to all this legislation. That was the first global piece of legislation looking at modern slavery. And then others have followed suit. What I'd say is that they're becoming a lot more strict.
Do we have an estimate of roughly how many people are in forced labour worldwide?
Yeah. I mean, the latest stats from the ILO in terms of numbers is around 40 million. Within the private economy itself, it's around 20 million. So there's significant numbers of individuals in forced labour globally. And the latest stats in terms of goods made from forced labour is around the $250 billion mark. I'll be honest, it is widespread throughout value chains, and it is occurring in almost all supply chains. So
it's a really significant issue that all companies need to be aware of throughout their supply chain.
Yeah, it's a really significant issue, which I think most companies don't realise the scale of the risk. And it's why due diligence management systems are really important. Having policies, etc., is the first step, but you really need to have due diligence management systems to identify these high risk areas. That really is key because it is so widespread. And if you're not finding forced labour, actually, I think you're not doing a good enough job because you should be detecting forced labour in your supply chains. That's how widespread it is.
Do you think it's true to say that forced labour is a hidden risk for businesses? That term's bandied about quite a bit.
I think numerous reports have, particularly from the UN, have described forced labour as this hidden risk. It is a hidden risk in the sense of it's not traditionally found in traditional methods of say auditing, social auditing, due diligence processes. It can be very difficult to detect forced labour because it is naturally a criminal act. It's not obvious, but to say it's hidden, I think is not entirely true. It is entirely surrounded by predictable business models, and where you look for these predictable business models, you most certainly will find forced labour. It is endemic throughout global supply chains. I think that really is key. It is significant. It's a significant risk. It's a significant human rights risk that's occurring widespread.
So what do you think some of those indicators are then that businesses or individuals and organisations should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about predictable business models, there are very obvious indicators that you should prioritise. And you should go through a prioritization process in your supply chain to look at this. You should start off with what goods and services you're procuring within your supply chain. And when I say it's surrounded by entirely predictable business models, there are things which to me really stand out as to being very high risk. Things like third-party agencies, intermediaries are traditionally associated with debt bondage, recruitment fees, etc. The use of recruitment agencies, we call them intermediaries, are really very high risk because they're not under the due diligence management systems of a site, which traditionally have always been audited, or your first and second tier supply chains have often been audited. But outside that scope, things like agencies are often not looked at. They've always been a high risk area. When I talk about predictable business models, are things that really are obviously high risk that need to be looked at. You know, you're talking about warehousing, you're talking about anything. What I would say is you can categorize this. Anything where there's potential low skill, labour intense, use of vulnerable workers, such as migrant workers, where jobs could be easier to get in the sense of they migrated over to get employment. So those areas can be significantly higher risk than, say, working in an office, that side of things. So there really are areas that are predictable and
key things to look out for.
Yeah, really key things that should be looked at, and it does depend on your supply chain. And you know, you would need if you don't know what you're looking for, assistance on looking at these sort of obvious patterns. But yeah, there are clear signs throughout supply chains as to where it's likely to be occurring.
Why do you think it's particularly hard then for businesses to gain a full view of their supply chain and determine where forced labour occurs?
I think that's a key point, and it goes down to, do they understand their supply chains in a way that they need to understand their supply chains for this upcoming regulation? You know, we mentioned some of the forced labour regulations at the start, the Forced Labour Act. There's other significant due diligence legislation coming out which is looking at forced labour in Europe. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, one of the 22 human rights aspects within the CSDD is forced labour. That is a full scope value chain due diligence. It's no longer acceptable just to say I've done an audit on my tier 1 or my tier 2 suppliers. So I think really fundamentally understanding your supply chain is incredibly important for understanding whether there's forced labour aspects or high risk pockets of forced labour within the supply chain. Often when we talk about these aspects, they're occurring beyond any audited sites because the end users, the brands, etc., haven't gone that far. They aren't aware of their supply chain beyond their tier 2s, and often actually the tier 1s. So it's having a full understanding of your supply chain and making sure that companies are aware of all tiers down to raw materials. So that's really key.
So what can companies do to gain a better vision throughout their supply chain of all the different tiers?
So regulation's pushing this. It's making it really mandatory that companies now need to do full value chain analysis. They need to understand their full supply chains. Using the use of technology is really important here. This is not an easy task. There are significant barriers to understanding your full supply chains. Some industries do it better than others. Some industries have it easier than others as well. It's you know, some supply chains are much more complex than others. If we're talking about food, for example, in the UK, a lot of our vegetables in winter are coming from Spain or from North Africa, sunnier climates, etc. These goods are perishable, so you know, the supply chain is naturally quite short because they have to get from A to B very quickly because of the perishable nature of the good. So you often do not have a lot of links in those supply chains. It's less complex. And when I used to work in agriculture, you know, we used to source from Murcia in southern Spain, which is the heartland of Spanish agriculture, and it immediately used to go on freight into the UK, and it immediately goes into pack houses in the UK and then into the supermarkets. That's an A to B supply chain. That is not complex. You could, you know, the raw material stage of that supply chain is really the farming aspects, which you can very easily go and assess if there's forced labour.
And it's not to say that there isn't forced labour, but it's easier to determine whether there is, because you've got very defined short links in the supply chain.
Exactly. If we're talking about a much more complex supply chain, something like a lithium-ion battery, cobalt and lithium are really important for batteries. So we're talking about sourcing raw materials from Democratic Republic of the Congo when it comes to cobalt, or from South America, Chile, etc. for lithium, Australia, etc. It then needs to be processed, it needs to be refined, it needs to be smelted. It then needs to go into developing the chemical stages for lithium ions, the electrolytes and the anodes and cathodes. It then needs to be put together, the battery. It then needs to be assembled into a product. We're talking numerous tiers here, 8, 9, 10 tiers.
So really hard for companies to get proper visibility on what's going on.
Really long supply chains, and getting back to the raw material stage, or potentially the areas where these indicators of low skill, high working hours often in manufacturing settings, finding that in your supply chain can be quite complex, because it's eight tiers down from where you've purchased it. So it is understanding the supply chain in detail, and unfortunately some industries are going to they have to do it regardless, but we'll have a tougher job of doing this in other industries, simply because of the nature of the product.
And so why is the traditional audit-based approach not effective in these situations when it comes to identifying forced labour in company supply chains?
So I used to be a human rights auditor for numerous years, and my job really in agriculture and fashion, in many of the industries I've worked in the past, have relied on audit as the predominant means of a company detecting human rights issues, social issues in their supply chain. And what I would say is that these audits primarily rely on evidence within an audit to raise non-conformances. There is a significant lack of evidence when it comes to forced labour, and triangulating these evidence points as well. So what you often do with an audit is it's a snapshot in time. You're visiting a factory or a site or a farm on a day. They're often either announced, so the site itself knows that you're coming. They're not going to be obvious and using forced labour on the day an auditor turns up, for example. Although you can do unannounced audits, which is much better when it comes to this sort of thing. Regardless of that, I think they're a snapshot in time. They rely on evidence within the actual audit itself, and they rely on, particularly social audits, talking to workers. An individual in a situation of forced labour, there are significant barriers to disclosure. They often do not know they're being exploited. They often are unaware of their situation. So most victims of forced labour do not know they're a victim of forced labour. It is not even obvious to them that they're being exploited. So the traditional method of talking to workers is just not, it's not good. You're there for 2 hours maybe in an audit talking to workers. They're not going to disclose to you that they're being exploited. They don't trust you. They don't know who you are. You're there to do a social audit on behalf of a brand. They're not going to tell you that I'm being exploited. It is not a good method for detecting forced labour, and it goes underreported in audits, significantly underreported in audits a lot of times. You can do techniques to increase the detection of forced labour in an audit. You can deep dive. You can go and audit intermediaries and agencies and deliberately choose high-risk pockets. And that's what we used to do when I was working in agriculture. We deliberately went and audited high-risk pockets where you're much more likely to find forced labour. And you also can use techniques like forced labour risk questionnaires within an sort of a interview setting if you suspect that there's potential pockets of forced labour. So really trying to get extra information that you might not get during a traditional one-size-fits-all social audit. So there are things you can do. Even with those additional deep dives, forced labour still is very complex and very difficult to detect.
So what about some of the countries that are actually deemed as low risk when it comes to forced labour? Do you still see issues there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And often companies will deem that low risk countries don't need looking at all. And they make the mistake that there's no forced labour because some third party data platforms told me that that country is low risk. even in low-risk countries, let's take the United Kingdom as an example, there are very high-risk pockets of forced labour within a country. The UK in itself has strong legislation when it comes to forced labour. In fact, the UK led the way in 2015 with the Modern Slavery Act, which was the first modern slavery piece of legislation globally. So the UK really led the way when it came to legislation, and we have strong laws in the UK when it comes to labour rights. However, even in the UK, there's significantly high risk pockets of forced labour. Let's talk about agriculture and agency use in agriculture. I used to come across forced labour within agriculture in the UK itself, because there are significant migrant flows in the summer months. Significant amounts of harvesting occurs in the United Kingdom. So there is significant risks of those migrant flows into the UK of forced labour. They do occur, they are occurring, and there's around 20,000 cases of forced labour a year in the UK. So even in a low-risk country like the UK, there are high-risk pockets. So it is not a case of that country is low risk, there is no forced labour. That's not going to the level deep enough, really, that actually this legislation is asking for. If you have high risk pockets, and you need to be aware of these high risk pockets, you will have to ensure there's no forced labour.
So companies really do have to look across the length and breadth of their supply chain then?
Full supply chain. It's the full scope of the supply chain, and not just dismissing countries at the risk identification stage because it's low risk. It's ensuring that actually are there high risk pockets within that country.
So how can TDi Sustainability help companies then to go beyond the traditional social audit approach when it comes to forced labour and really take a holistic view of their supply chain?
Yeah, that's a good question, and many of us are, particularly in TDi, ex-auditors, and we're really aware of these limitations to the current methods. So we ourselves are experts in supply chain mapping and supply chain due diligence, and many of us have significant experience of developing frameworks to deep dive into these aspects. Frameworks for auditing intermediaries, agencies. So TDi itself is well placed. We can really help companies deep dive into their supply chains, look at these high risk pockets, helping them prioritize, because this really is a prioritization piece. Brands and companies themselves cannot do everything. Sustainability budgets are often limited. Where do I need to prioritize my resources to ensure that I have the maximum amount of impact when it comes to risk and reducing and mitigating that risk? So it is starting with the highest risk areas, and TDi really can help prioritize when it comes to due diligence those highest risk areas. So that's the first part where we really can help. So we've just done a huge piece on forced labour for one of the largest tech companies globally. When it came to this toolkit, we were looking at, say, 5 of the key metals that go into consumer electronics: gold, silicon, aluminium, lithium and cobalt. And we deep dived into those supply chains, and we did map the supply chain all the way back from the finished good to the raw material, and looking at the countries where these stages, the tiers of their supply chains are produced. And then we looked at indicators of forced labour, risks of forced labour within these operations, the business activities themselves, and the countries themselves. So that's something I think is a really good example of where we prioritise risk for a really large tech company.
And so can that toolkit be applied to other companies? Yeah,
absolutely. The methodology can be applied to any company on any good. We did deep dive into the countries and the country legislation on forced labour and how much forced labour is occurring in those countries, etc. But as I mentioned, even low-risk countries have high-risk pockets of forced labour. So what we then did is looked at the business activities within the countries to assess whether there were high-risk pockets within the business activities. Things like electronic assembly, for example, in certain countries is very high risk for forced labour because there's numerous factors there. They often are labour intense, low skill, and workers doing them are often vulnerable. Often migrant workers are doing these jobs in factories. So it's these areas, and looking for pockets of high risk areas is how we approach that, and we help prioritise these key forced labour risks for this tech company by really digging deep, not just in country, but business activity risks.
So thinking about two of the materials you mentioned there, aluminium and silicon, what were some of the key areas of risk that you looked at there in terms of forced labour?
I think this is the key. Aluminium is really used globally for numerous industries. It's a core, it's a critical mineral really for numerous industries, and particularly for tech. When we talk about aluminium in electronics, it's really used significantly sort of in laptops, in mobile phone cases. It's a predominant material in the casing for these electronic components, and silicon itself, going on to that one, is really heavily used in microchips, in the chips themselves. These two metals are very high risk potentially. There are very high risk areas. I think let's go to the country level. So 10% of global aluminium is coming from Xinjiang in China. I think if anyone knows forced labor and the forced labor regulations, particularly the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, etc. in the US, Xinjiang is a high risk region because there is state-sponsored forced labor in China within this region. So Xinjiang itself is unbelievably high risk. We're talking one of the highest risk regions in the world for forced labour, simply because of the policies in place in that part of the world. And 10% of global aluminium is coming from there. Significant amount of silicon is also coming from there, particularly for, let's say, the photovoltaic industry. The PV cells themselves use a significant amount of polysilicon from Xinjiang. About 40% of global polysilicon is coming from that region. What
can companies do to try to ensure that their silicon and aluminium are not linked to Xinjiang?
It goes back to traceability. It goes back to full understanding your supply chain and understanding that your goods themselves, the aluminium itself, the silicon is not coming from regions of very high risk. So understanding your raw material. So it is the raw material stages of those supply chains which are very high risk when it comes to aluminium and silicon. There are also, when it comes later on in the electronic assembly stage, very high risk areas. But actually at the raw material stage, the base of those supply chains, aluminium and silicon are potentially very high risk and would be in breach of the forced labour regulations. Particularly in the US, the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act is very significantly looking at Xinjiang. In fact, it takes a stance that if it's coming from Xinjiang, it's likely that forced labour has occurred. So just understanding your supply chain, traceability, using technology, deep diving into your supply chains and understanding your beyond tier 1 and 2s and taking that approach to mapping your supply chains.
So it's complicated, but there are clear steps there that you've mentioned that companies can take to try and really understand their supply chains. And while it might not be possible to completely eradicate forced labour from areas like Xinjiang, companies can take steps to become aware of where their products or materials are coming from and then take the next steps to then remove those elements from their supply chain and look for alternatives.
Exactly that, and it really gives a prioritization piece, is what metals, materials, etc. Not just metals, what materials am I sourcing in my supply chains, and which of these are likely to be the highest risk for forced labor, and then deep diving into those materials as a priority. Obviously there's constraints to budget, constraints to time, you have limited resources in sustainability departments, but it is mapping and doing materiality assessments of your products, which ones are potentially the highest risk for forced labour, and using experts who can assist you in that and really helping you prioritise those materials, because then you can then focus your time and resources on the next steps and deep diving, which is really key, because it can be overwhelming to start with if you've got a complex supply chain. Which materials do I start with? It's really the first step is prioritization and where do I prioritize my time to mitigate those risks as best as I can.
So when it comes to the EU forced labour regulation, what do you think are the key first steps a company should take to make sure they're prepared for it?
I think first off is mapping the regulation and what they're asking of you. I think this is the first step for any regulation that's proposed, is what is it asking of me as a company. First off, mapping that out and then understanding my exposure potentially to that regulation. So going into, okay, so what am I sourcing? What is high risk for forced labour? Going through that exercise. And I use this term materiality, and it's used a lot in other regulations. CSRD uses double materiality, etc. It's a prioritization piece, and that's really what it is at the beginning, is understanding which of my products is high risk, and going through that exercise and using you can either do that yourself if you've got a big team in your sustainability department, or you can get assistance and get help from consultants who are experts in this field to help with materiality, and that is the first step. Understanding what the regulations are asking of me, and then what is my exposure to that regulation.
Are there steps that you think companies can take to go beyond compliance to really make a difference to the root cause of these forced labour issues?
I think that's the real key. We're no longer looking at the spectrum of risk here. We're going away from risk to say impact, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. Really, within risk compliance, you're just assessing risk and trying to mitigate that risk as best you can. There will be limitations to that, and you will have to, once you've dug deep enough, potentially go into the other end of the spectrum, which is more towards impact and understanding what these things, these due diligence processes that I put in place, how are they actually impacting real people on the ground? Is it reducing forced labour? A key thing here when it comes to forced labour is a lot of it is to do with poverty. A lot of root causes, aspects, etc., to do with poverty. So when you're looking at the other end of the spectrum, when say with impact, you're really looking at your buying principles and your buying practices, and your, am I paying suppliers enough? And looking at, from a holistic approach, am I really paying these suppliers a fair amount for these goods that I've procured? We saw it quite a bit when I used to work in ethical trade teams. Not talking to procurement teams is actually procurement and sourcing can perpetuate a lot of these human rights impacts. So from a holistic approach, it's also looking at yourself as a company and purchasing practices, buying practices, lead times. These aspects are really key.
Thank you, James. I'm sure today's conversation has given our viewers some food for thought when it comes to thinking about forced labour in supply chains, and just how complex supply chains can be and how difficult it can be to identify some of these really serious issues. And it's clear that the consequences for not identifying those issues are going to become even more serious going forwards with all of the new legislation and regulations that James has highlighted today. If you need help in your company in identifying some of these areas of risk, looking for areas that could be high risk, and even those areas that James identified in today's conversation that are deemed low risk, where there could still be issues of forced labour, then please get in touch with TDi Sustainability. We have the experts who can help you. And the TDi Forced Labour Toolkit is there as a really integrated approach to looking across your supply chain at all of the issues surrounding forced labour. So thank you very much for listening today. Please join us for the next episode of TDi Insights. Stay tuned.